All right. And I will share the link. And this is just a quick sync up kickoff session for Cluster API. We're working on defining the initial control plane management CAEP for V1 Alpha 3. We discussed, at the face-to-face, some of the guiding principles. We wanted to make sure that, we're focusing on evolution versus revolution. We don't want to kind of.
Oh, he's joining. Hardik is just about to join.
Okay, great.
Yeah, he just responded. So if we just pause for maybe like a minute, he'll. There we go.
Hi, Hardik.
Hi, Jason. Chuck.
Hey, Hardik.
Hey.
Hey, I really sorry. I just do something. Really sorry.
No, it's all good.
Yeah, just as an overview, the guiding principles that we want to focus on as we define the control plane management. We want to focus on evolution instead of revolution. We don't want to try to reboil the ocean. We want to try to start with what we have today and try to move that forward. The other thing that we want to focus on is we want to take a batteries included but swappable type approach. So we need to make sure that we have that kind of extensibility in mind, but we do want to, at least for the initial focus of this CAEP, the initial default experience for what we're looking to do. And with that, I think probably the best place to go is we can start with reviewing the goals and non-goals that we defined at the face-to-face. I was talking with Chuck and some other folks yesterday. We decided to split the original goals that we had defined down into kind of two overarching concepts, one being kind of overall goals for control plane management, and then one of them being specifically around the default implementation that we defined of being kubeadm and machine-based. So for the overall goals, obviously we want to be able to establish new resource types for the control plane management that we're trying to define. There was some controversy over whether or not we should be able to modify existing resource types. So I think that's something that we need to try to nail down as we start working through the initial design. We wanted to be able to support both single node and HA control planes. We should enable declarative orchestrated control plane upgrades. And we need to leave room to support the following features: in-place control plane upgrades in the future, pod-based or other topologies for control planes, some eventual cloud provider, load balancer, endpoints provider for control plane machines. We specifically wanted to call these out, even though they are generally non-goals for the initial deliverable, but we wanted to make sure that we keep kind of these use cases in mind as we scope out the initial design to avoid precluding those things in the future. For the default implementation, we need to kind of reword this one, but we want to make sure that it's possible to allow different infrastructure providers to be used for machines. So make sure that anything that we implement isn't tied into one specific infrastructure provider. Should be able to do it without, the infrastructure provider should be able to consume it without duplication of effort. Yep. For the default implementation, we wanted to scope it to specifically managing stacked etcd for control plane management. That wouldn't be precluding being able to do other types of etcd in the future. We want to make sure to enable scaling of the number of nodes in a control plane deployment, potentially limiting the ability to scale down. And we want to be able to support pre-existing and user-managed external etcd clusters. So that would basically be make sure that we can plumb through the support that already exists using kubeadm to interact with external etcd clusters. Is there anything around the goals that anybody thinks we're missing, or?
One question I think that I have is, do we need to specify in the goals whether we will rely on kubeadm control plane join, or whether we will you have a cluster API bootstrap, or sorry, I guess it would be the kubeadm bootstrap provider, pass in all of the bits of information, certificates, etc., that I think are currently being passed in, or retrieved by kubeadm using the workload cluster itself. Or is that something that we could just talk about later?
Yeah, I think that falls closer into the implementation details, I think.
Okay. I guess on some degree we've already decided on like some implementation details by talking about a default implementation, but
yeah. But at this point, most of it is high level though, and not necessarily about the mechanics of.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
How we're doing it.
Okay.
All right. In that case, yeah.
Sorry. One other thing. I think I mentioned this last week. Do we need to say anything about? I mean, so I think it's clear that we are doing replace upgrades. Although did we mention that somewhere? I guess it's important when we say so to support single node NHA control plane nodes. So for a single node, if we have a replace upgrade, then you need to have spare capacity. Just as we should note that for anybody that's.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I'll add that to the doc.
All right. All right. In that case, let's go ahead and go down to the non-goals. Again, our little blurb that we came about, non-goals listed in this document are intended to be scope bound for current V1L3 implementation and are subject to change based on user feedback over time. So anything specified here is not saying that is out of scope for future releases of the project. We're just considering non-goals within the scope of this project for the initial V1L3 implementation. So the proposal does not address non-machine-based topologies at this time. That's not preventing it from potentially happening in parallel or as a follow-on. We are not attempting to do CA certificate management outside of what is provided by the initial kubeadm bootstrapping. To manage external etcd deployments, and I know there were some things around how we scope this, so we probably want to elaborate on that a little bit more. And that's specifically, in this case, we're saying not to manage kind of standalone etcd deployments that are managed by cluster API that are used in a non-stacked control plane deployment scenario, rather than saying that we couldn't interact with an external etcd, a standing up control plane, to address disaster recovery constraints, so backup and restore of the etcd data for now. We've called out rollback behavior as being a non-goal for V1 Alpha 3. I'm pretty sure everybody here is familiar with all of the various edge cases we could hit with that. So I think it's some that we'll have to tackle in the future, but for at least the initial MVP release, it seems very a big rabbit hole that we probably don't want to try to tackle right now. Configuration mutation, so modification of configuration files on disk for the control plane instances, managing non-node control plane, manage Kubernetes services right now. Obviously, we've talked about that for longer term, but just not for V1 Alpha 3. Automatic remediation of nodes that go into a bad state. A lot of this is going to depend on the node health and remediation, which is being done kind of in a separate step. So I think we would probably want to build automatic remediation in the future based on the work that is being done in the through the remediation stuff for regular nodes. And then configurable cloud provider, cloud controller manager. We don't want to take on the automatic management of that or the automatic management of CNI configuration. I don't expect too much of that to be controversial, at least based on the discussions that we had last week.
Just one thing. So, at least to me, it looks perfectly fine. I was just curious. So the possibility of the external etcds, right? So where not the clusters managed externally by the users, where the etcds are basically managed as pods and so on. Mm-hmm. So that does not as such fall in the non-goals, right? I mean, I understand that we don't have to consider it now and do it for the V1 Alpha 3, but at least in future there should be a scope where we might want to manage the etcd externally, where we create the pods of the etcds, and that should still fall under the future goals, right?
Yes.
It should fall under the living room for the future development.
Yeah, and I think we've broached on it from a high level with just saying like pod-based control plane. In my mind, that was like an umbrella that would cover also the pod-based etcd as well.
Oh, okay. Yes. That's true. Yeah, that makes sense. That's true. I think when we take that approach, then we by default assume that everything will go that way. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. That's all I had really planned on as far as like an agenda for this meeting. I figured anything else we would do would be kind of self-guided. So
I guess I'm curious how we'd like to work together on this. I'm sure we all have our own opinions and ideas of what the implementation will look like. Do you think it'd be worthwhile if we like piece together some POCs and kind of play around with stuff, or should we kind of agree upon a design first? Are there any strong preferences for how we actually approach like filling this out? I mean, like we'll have to fill this out. I assume we can divide that work up, or we can all just kind of tackle it. And then as far as implementation goes.
So in my opinion, if you start doing the POCs without having enough agreements, at least among 3 or 4 of us, will end up wasting quite so much effort. It would be actually nice if we can just from the high level prepare a sort of design that we have in the mind, probably in terms of how could the CRDs look like, or how could the overall stack look like. And then we can discuss the designs of all 4 of us, and once we have something, we can probably try to align on that.
So, I think that's reasonable. I would like to see, yeah, I mean, that's sort of, I guess, part of the design details is sort of like specking out the CRDs and what those are going to look like.
Yes.
Yeah, I can.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jason.
So I was just going to say, like, looking at kind of the way that at least upstream we've handled control plane management so far with where we've externalized it with the kubeadm and control or machine-based deployments, and what we've done with the Cluster API upgrade tool for automating upgrades of those. I was like, my initial thought was we can basically work backwards from that and figure out how can we encapsulate that as in a more formalized manner. And I can definitely throw some together as far as what those API types would look like for that model, if that would help.
See, that would be looking at what, like how kubeadm treats a control plane. I kind of missed that part.
Yeah, so basically, kind of the ways that we've externalized the control plane management so far, you know, how we've generally told people as far as the upstream community, here's how you stand up a multi-node control plane.
Yeah.
Here's how you are able to upgrade that control plane from one version to the next.
Yep.
Try to basically just take that workflow that we're doing and turn that into a data model that could internalize that with a lot of hand-wavy implementation.
Yeah. I think that sounds really good. One other thing I would like to do in that process is also kind of capture the general behaviors we're expecting this controller to handle. Like, does this controller handle upgrades of control plane? I know we say control plane management, but like we should define what that means more specifically as well.
Definitely.
Cool.
Yeah. Do we want to put that in the goals? That's a good point.
We could probably add just another section for it and just put it somewhere under the design details, I would guess.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe a goal is to define like behaviors of a control plane manager, but it's sort of like we'll have to do that regardless.
No, but I mean, just like support upgrades. Is that?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Oh, so right. I think we already had that listed as a goal.
Oh, do we? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that was like.
Yeah, the third goal.
Yeah, enable a declarative orchestrated control plane upgrades. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
I actually had one question. So back then I can remember we discussing we were discussing of the possibility of CRT, which was called control plane provider CRTs, right? So right now, if you see, we have bootstrap providers, we have infrastructure reference or infrastructure providers, and then I could remember the discussion of control plane provider CRT, but that has not yet got in, right? So do any of us know what was the progress or what is happening for that specific CRT? Is it in the pipeline or for any reason it stepped down?
So are you talking about like a generic control plane type CRD or one that would be specific to the default implementation?
I was hoping for a generic one. So basically a kind of CRD which becomes a point of pluggability from where the controller gets to decide that because this provider is X, this should be deployed in X way, and because the CRD is mentioning, the field is mentioning about why it should be deployed in a Y way. So I'm more thinking of in a way that how can we plug different existing models inside the cluster API. So of course the default implementation will stay and will not physically require user to mess with all the details. So by default, user will always, the flow will always be in a way that the control plane CRD or the bootstrap provider CRD will be set up to the kubeadm, and you see the full-fledged cluster with the dedicated machines. But if user is aware of the internals of it and would probably explicitly what to mention, that I want Y provider, which could be something else from the kubeadm and something else which could basically spawn the control plane itself in a different way, then that's where we can provide the plug, right?
Yep. So I think there are two ways that we can approach that. One, we can build just like a generic control plane concept, and then the other one is that we can basically modify the existing cluster object today to provide that point of pluggability. And I think I personally lean towards adding it directly to the cluster object. Only because right now we have a cluster resource that doesn't really represent an actual cluster today. And I want to make sure that as we start building out additional functionality and features, that we're doing it in a way that it rolls that information back up to that generic cluster object, so that the cluster actually represents a cluster rather than just like this weird thing that sort of does like prerequisite infrastructure, but not actually anything to do with the actual cluster that we're deploying.
Yes, that makes sense. Yes. I mean, we just need a way to describe the information. I mean, I also do not as such personally lean toward adding unnecessary new CRDs. If we can find a good place in the cluster, which I think sounds good as well, and fits in the semantics of it, then should be fine.
All right. It looks like we're 3 minutes over already. So I think the next steps, I'll go ahead and I'll work out getting those initial data model definitions out. I'll try to get that done within the next 2 days. Chuck, you were mentioning the describing the behaviors. Is that something that you're willing to take on?
Yeah, for sure. I can write that down in this doc.
All right, great. And then other than that, I think we should probably start gathering some of our user stories around managing control planes, both for kind of the default implementation, but also I want to start gathering some of those user stories around the non-default scenarios. So I know, Daniel, you have some ideas around that, and Hardik, you do as well. So is that something that you both are willing to take on to help define?
Yes, sure. So what I would love to do is that, so if I understand correctly, when you say you would try to define the new data model, I would like to participate with you and try to figure out a good way that how can we add a data model where the new control plane provider can be plugged in a non-disruptive way. So I would like to make sure that the existing flow remains as similar as it is right now, maybe with a very minor data type changes if required. We should be able to offer the new controller implementation, which basically deploys the control plane in something else than the machine-based infrastructure. So if possible, I'll probably get in touch with you and try to provide hints on the design doc.
Yeah, definitely. As soon as I get my initial brain dump on paper, I'll reach out to everybody, and we can continue to iterate on it in a asynchronous manner. I just want to make sure that we kind of identify owners for some of the action items before we wrapped up this meeting to kind of lead up some of that work.
Sure, perfect. That sounds great.
All right. Is there anything else that we should track for action items coming out of this right now?
No, I think we have a good start.
Yeah, I also think so. It's a good start. So I would say let's try to keep the more frequent iterations, like probably middle of the next week or early of the next week would be nice to have again. It doesn't mean that we necessarily have to complete everything and then come here, but if we can just see each other again and review the ongoing work, that will help us at least make it better. So that's how this I look at it.
Yep, that sounds great. I'll also work on trying to find a convenient time for folks early next week so that we can reconvene too.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
All right, John.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, bye.